Part of the practice of this moment in this sort of non-dualistic initiation is to really understand how entitlement and victimhood lives within our bodies at a somatic level, how it's playing out in our relational field, and really trying to track it and see it and be a student of our culture and see how it plays out in that broader societal field. Contemplation is definitely a sort of critical path. And not just contemplation about spiritual aspects of our lives, but contemplation about erotic aspects of our lives, about political aspects of our lives. The more we remove the scarcity from our heart, the more in trust we will be of the universe and the planet, and the less we will need, and the more in touch we will be with our context and those around us.
Welcome to this week's Timeless edition. We know that our epics are vast and deep, and that we're in this time of the age of information and attention. Each podcast episode is filled with so much wisdom and new ways of seeing. And in this culture, there's a propensity to make more and more and more and more. We want to contribute to a culture of meaning, care, and presence. And we know that wisdom is timeless. And so in these short episodes, we share a piece of timeless wisdom. Next week, we will be back with a new full-length, deep conversation, the first of this series. As always, if you find what we offer here at all that we are supportive, please dive deeper with us. You can find out on our website how to join the Rhythm, our membership space where we meet twice a week to practice together and expand our capacity for presence and love. We wish to create and take part in more in-person events. If you have any ideas, please get in touch to collaborate. Holding spaces both online and offline feels so important in so many ways. We still believe in the online because we know that so many people that can't get out to events for all kinds of reasons, from care responsibilities to financial restrictions, that these spaces allow us to connect deeper no matter what else is going on in our lives. And yet there is something really beautiful about being together in person, of course. This week's Timeless is from our archives, part of a beautiful and powerful conversation we had back in 2020 in episode 123 with Alnoor Ladha on post-capitalism, mystical anarchism and solidarity, entitled Entrusted with Everything, Entitled to Nothing. We hope that hearing just this small part will give you space to contemplate, integrate, and embody what is shared here. Alnoor Ladha is a co-director of the Transition Resource Circle and co-author of the book Post-Capitalist Philanthropy, Healing Wealth in the Time of Collapse. Alnoor's work focuses on the intersection of political organizing, systems thinking, structural change, and narrative work. He was the co-founder and executive director of The Rules, a global network of activists, organizers, designers, coders, researchers, writers, and others focused on changing the rules that create inequality, poverty, and climate change. The Rules started in 2012 as a time-bound project and an experiment in temporary organizational design, exploring new ways of how to work, play, and make trouble together. Alnoor comes from a Sufi lineage and writes about the crossroads of politics and spirituality in troubled times. His work has been published in Al Jazeera, The Guardian, Truth Out, Fast Company, Cosmos Journal, New Internationalist, and The Huffington Post, among others. He is the council chair of Culture Hacks Lab, a cooperatively run advisory for social movements and progressive organizations. This Timeless explores the question, which feels very pertinent right in this moment, how to build a post-capitalist prayer. I hope that these words awaken something deep in your bones and in your soul and help you to dissolve the scarcity of your heart. Welcome to All That We Are, with me, your host, Amisha Tala Oak. On this show, we explore the weave between activism, the sacred, creativity, and regeneration, the spaces where our inner and outer worlds dance. From healing trauma to nature connection, to new technologies, to ancient wisdom, it's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a more beautiful future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to listen, to ask ourselves the big questions and to share what we are already doing and envisioning, we create the futures of our wildest dreams, and we begin to embody all that we are becoming, and all that is possible.
It feels like we are in like a deep bifurcation, extreme light, extreme dark, beautiful alternatives on one side and extreme psychosis on the other. And that polarization is getting deeper and more divided. And at the same time, we are being initiated as a culture into non-dualistic thought and into non-dualistic being able to hold multiple competing perspectives simultaneously and being comfortable with ambiguity and chaos and indeterminacy, almost in preparation for greater breakdown and tragedy and renewal and rebirth. And so it's multiple simultaneous realities, it feels like, happening. And in some ways, I feel like the kind of two biggest thought forms, if you will, and by biggest, I mean, the most reified, the strongest, are entitlement and victimhood. We're all holding a sense of victimhood and we're all holding a sense of entitlement at the same time. And really seeing how victimhood plays out, especially in, spaces where I operate, which is leftist political circles and anarchist groups and activist groups, the sense of victimhood is so strong, right? And this belief in something is happening to me, rather than something is happening through me, which is a more kind of mystical, nonlinear way to see the world. And then the thought form of entitlement, although we predominantly see it in people with privilege and dominator class, etc., it's in all of us as well. And so I think part of the practice of this moment in this sort of non-dualistic initiation is to really understand how entitlement and victimhood lives within our bodies at a somatic level, how it's playing out in our relational field, and really trying to track it and see it and be a student of our culture and see how it plays out in that broader societal field. Yeah, it's such a personal journey, right? And I'm not a person to say these are ways or pathways to do this work, but what I can say is from my personal practice over the years, like I grew up in a Sufi tradition, and so I grew up spending a lot of time in contemplation and prayer with my family, with my extended family. This is sort of what we did, and I think also infused with the fact that both my parents are East African immigrants who moved to Canada, very different migrational routes. They come from a similar spiritual impulse. They always had an internationalist, cosmopolitan lens because they were displaced peoples. And so there was a certain, diaspora consciousness merged with a certain sort of mystical tradition. And that definitely informed my early understanding of the fact that spiritual work and political work are not separate. And so as I finished university and moved into political space, first as a political consultant and strategist and policy person, and then later as an activist and organizer, and then I moved into sort of narrative intervention work with various social movements, I started to realize that actually the application of my spiritual work in political contexts was an accelerator. This old idea that, well, I'm going to spend my time in sort of spiritual practice and achieve spiritual enlightenment, and then I will be useful to the community, right? The idea of like, well, you just have to do your inner work, I find deeply problematic. I think this is like a false dualism, a false binary that is preventing spiritual communities from actually engaging with what's happening in the world. And what I've found is the more I'm in solidarity with other communities, with marginalized peoples, with people who are facing, structural violence from the existing system, that I start to more deeply see the entanglement of how the dominant culture of our time, which I was socialized in, being, born and raised in Canada and living in London for many years, and then New York for many years, and then South Africa, and now in Costa Rica. And I see sort of my role in that more and more, right? And I also see that solidarity is not a political concept. It's not something that just activists do. It's an active, embodied spiritual practice. It's also a pathway to spiritual development. My sort of understanding of the entanglement of these things and the sort of constellational worldview of how all of these things are connected, from the way I consume to where my food comes from, where my energy comes from, where my water comes from, how I am with other people, how patriarchy plays out in my day-to-day interactions, or how racial hierarchy plays out in my day-to-day interactions, is so deeply interconnected within the culture in which we live. The way I see this is like being a good student of our culture and really understanding the impoverishments of the culture in which we were born and socialized, which for many of us is the dominant culture of the West, of industrialized capitalism, is part of the spiritual practice. There's that old Buddhist line, which is enlightenment doesn't happen in the cave, it happens in the mouth of the lion. And capitalism is the mouth of the lion. And so when you see these interactions between these things, and then you're in the grocery store and you realize like, oh, I'm getting asparagus in London in December, that there is implications to that. Like that's when I think a sort of a deeper understanding and a deeper spiritual practice can be gleaned and accessed. Part of that spiritual practice as well for me is like contemplation on what's happening outside of my body as well. What's happening in the external world is a larger fractal of my micro fractal of my body. These things are not separate. And so the deeper my contemplation in the interlinking between these two things, like what's happening in my body, what's happening in my immediate environment, what's happening in my community, what's happening at the global level, what's happening in my web of relations with other people, and how are these thought forms playing themselves out? If I could see that victimhood and entitlement are playing themselves out on this bigger stage, they're also playing themselves out in my body. And so part of my deprogramming work and my decolonization work, which I see as spiritual work and spiritual practice, is to understand, like, why do I feel entitled to X or Y or Z? There's a Sufi proverb attributed to the Great Mother, and she says to her children, you are entrusted with everything and entitled to nothing. You are entrusted with everything and entitled to nothing. So you're given this bounty of life, this relational web of beings, from your family to your ancestral DNA to your cosmic spiritual ancestry to every being you interact with, and the elements. And all of these are endowments, and you have to treat them as such. And there's nothing that you're actually entitled to or that you deserve, right? And if that's your starting point, if that's your like baseline logic of how you enter space and you enter the world and you enter circle with other human beings, then as soon as I feel entitled to something, it's my responsibility to go back and deprogram myself and understand where that entitlement comes from. In Western culture, that entitlement is so strong, right? Because we're taught to believe, we're entitled to money, and then money allows you to be entitled to anything you want, right? Whoever has money has access, right? And all of these old sort of tropes, without ever thinking about the consequences of where that money came from, how it was born, the extraction and dispossession and the blood that was required to acquire that money, and then what you're acquiring with that money. And that whole thing that comes with the sort of like culture of quote unquote, the market, right? Or more accurately, like market fundamentalism. The interaction of all of these things just happening that seem like they're just, the way things are deeply influencing, our neural nets, right? And our relational web. And they're so deeply intermeshed that it actually does require contemplation and time and space to sit back and say, these things are not outside of me. And if they're not outside of me, then I am responsible and I have co-agency in this creation. I come from a mystical spiritual tradition, and I come from an anarchist political tradition. And so, and in both of those traditions, there's a lot of overlap. There's the belief that our aim is sort of Gnostic, right? It's to have a direct relationship with wisdom or the divine or what have you. And so there's sort of infinite paths into this. I would say that contemplation is definitely a sort of critical path, and not just contemplation about spiritual aspects of our lives, but contemplation about erotic aspects of our lives, about political aspects of our lives. I'd also say solidarity as a spiritual practice putting yourself in the messiness of other people's needs and desire for self-governance and sovereignty, etc., is really a part of that. We've been taught that to be a citizen means that you vote every 4 years or what have you. And actually creating new kinds of relationships and interactions and being involved in like direct democracy processes, for example, citizens' assemblies, working with your local Extinction Rebellion group or Occupy groups or what have you. This is part of that practice. I'd say just the very practice of living the post-capitalist values is itself an act, but that requires being a good student of your culture and spending some time educating yourself, ourselves, on what's happening in the world as like an ongoing praxis. It's not just like a one-time thing you do. It's like we spend all of this time reading self-help books and doing spiritual development and being in our online Zoom meditation classes, whatever, but we don't really spend that time figuring out how the economic system works or the political system works and how it affects us. And part of the reason is that the dominant culture and establishment power elites, for example, try to obfuscate and make that realm seem really complicated, right? And it's actually not complicated in some ways. Like a simple way to see this, the market system is just a complex, adaptive, evolutionary system. It's alive, right? So when you understand that, like, our operating system is just a set of rules that are man-made that then create like a generative set of outcomes, right? So you invent something like compound interest, and then whoever has capital ends up getting exponential capital, and whoever has debt in that system ends up being in exponential debt. And these are just rules that have calcified, into, we almost think that they're laws of nature now. And so by understanding that the system is, in some ways, it's like the greatest artificial intelligence humans have ever created and maybe ever will, right? All this Silicon Valley people are waiting for the singularity, the time where computers take over human intelligence. And it's like singularities are already here, and it's late stage capitalism. And so when you understand that, then you start to think, well, it's actually incumbent on me, a citizen of troubled times, to understand the nature of this oxygen. And I think just that desire to do that, just that willingness, just that shift opens up the possibility for that contemplation, for that solidarity, for those practices to happen. As soon as we say politics is not something I'm interested in, or that's something beyond me, or whatever, then what we're actually doing is we're abdicating our responsibility. We're in support of the status quo. And so that willingness is just really in some ways, the prerequisite for that opening to happen, because you are in dialogue with an animate living planet. And as soon as you put your intention into that animate field and you say, I have a desire to better understand the impoverishment of my culture and how it's affecting the suffering of humanity and the more than human world, then answers will be given to you because you're opening up that space for dialogue. Who has power? Why do they have power? Who gets to decide? Who's being immiserated by the system? How do I be in service to them and into service to 200 species a day that are going extinct because our way of living, or the oceans that are being acidified? And almost in some ways replacing the word politics with the word power, and understanding that, like, being in contemplation of how power affects every aspect of our lives is our responsibility as spiritual beings and human beings incarnated on the planet right now. It's also like, sometimes I use the word they or power elites or one percenters, etc., but it is non-dualistic, right? I don't see them as outside of me. There's a one percenter that lives within all of us. There's a Trump that lives within all of us. And simultaneously, there are those who are benefiting from the existing system disproportionately and who are actively creating conditions and contexts that are increasing suffering for other beings. And that is not acceptable. But what we find often is, like, especially among spiritual communities and New Age communities, that there's this fear of judgment. The way I see it is actually this fear of judgment, or the fear of duality, for example, because there's this belief that we are all one, and we are all one, and we are in physically separate incarnations for now. And that matters. That has material implications on our experience. If you are a Black man or woman in the empire of the United States, you're having a very different physical experience. And having, just to play on the stereotype, but to have like a white yoga teacher from California say, well, we're all one, and I don't want to engage in the messiness of this judgment and duality, and who am I to judge, and who are you to judge, is actually supporting that existing system, right? As Howard Zinn used to say, you can't be neutral on a moving train. The question is, how do we get to this non-dualistic state as a contemplation where I know there's a 1%er in me? I know that there's this thought form of entitlement that I have, not just entitlement, privilege, the belief of superiority on some level, that I've given physical real estate in my body and in my neural net. And at the same time know that there are those who are actively working to keep this existing system in place. Those two things are true simultaneously. So I can say there is a 1%er, or Donald Trump did X, or Netanyahu did Y, or whatever. And both of those things are true at the same time. And this is why I say, like, we're being initiated into non-dualistic thought, because we have to be able to hold both of those perspectives so we could both deepen our spiritual work and our spiritual practice, because none of us are free until all of us are free, right? As the old abolitionist statement goes, that's spiritually true as well. We're just going to have to keep reincarnating over and over till we create a context and a structure in which all beings can be liberated. And that collective liberation is the goal of our spiritual work. These things are not separate. And the deeper we go into this work, and the deeper we go into this practice, and the deeper we go into our seva and our service for the living planet and the living cosmos, the more the entelechy of the human soul can be fulfilled. Part of our work then is to recontextualize our current moment and what's happening, and all of us have to do that work. And it also means that we have to re-sacralize meaning in some way. And so maybe I say something about both. So in terms of context, what's helpful for me to understand is these sort of broader cycles, right? So, in the Indian tradition, in the Vedic tradition, they'd say we're in the Kali Yuga right now, right? That's the belief that we're in the midst of the dark ages. We're in the world where everything is topsy-turvy, where the psychopathic get rewarded, and are seen as titans of industry, or become presidents and prime ministers, etc. So in the Buddhist tradition, they call this this period the Great Degeneration. In various other First Nations prophecies from Turtle Island, this is the time of the seventh fire, where we human beings have a choice to continue on this path or go the other way. And I think just even coming to grips with that is actually very helpful. And this also goes back to entitlement to a certain extent, right? This belief that things should be a certain way is an expectation that is setting us up for disappointment. People should tell the truth, and there should be justice. And, all of these kind of expectations we smuggle in to our sense making of the world. Actually, just by removing them and saying, no, we are in the dark ages. The people who get rewarded in this complex adaptive system that we talked about are the people who best serve the logic of the system. Well, what's the logic of the system? It's short-termist, it's psychotic, it's greedy, it's life-denying. So part of our practice is to disidentify and recontextualize. And, there's lots of ways to do that. And we've talked about a few of them, right? The practice of solidarity, contemplation, spiritual practices, tantra, yoga, meditation, work with psychedelics in containers that respect the traditions that they come from, and, treat these plant medicines as sacred. So there's lots of ways into getting to these boundary dissolving states where you can transcend the idea of subject object, us versus them, and see our broader role in the context. And then the second part of the equation, in the absence of meaning, is to re-sacralize meaning, spending time to think about what is the world I want to create, and what are the values by which I live. If I'm not going to be identified with the existing system, and I actually want to be a conscientious objector of late-stage capitalism, I have to spend time myself on the questions of first principles. what are my values? Where are we going as a civilization? What is my purpose? And for almost the whole period of modernity, this 5,000 year anomaly in human history, where we went from hunter gatherers for 99% of human history to the sort of patriarchal, extractive, gendered hierarchy, racialized hierarchy, sort of capitalist system where wealth is equated with success and goodness and all of that, then it's sort of incumbent on us to spend time reflecting on what our first principles are. Often what's happened is we've given that responsibility over to religion for a long period of time, right? And or to science and rationalism, the belief in progress as an arrow. So we don't really have to do anything because we're the apex species, and this apex species is in this like ever upward directionality towards utopia, right? Because these are the programs we're given. We ourselves have to relocate meaning in the way we live our lives. It's not going to be given to us through religions or institutions of power or anything else. That's a very powerful moment, and it's a very powerful initiation moment for us in a broken culture. The ending is falling into the beginning. And this is why I say, part of our spiritual practice is to be conscientious objectors of late stage capitalism. Because by being implicated in this life-destroying system, we are actually preventing our spiritual development. Because if anyone was to do the work of what their personal values are and what world they want to build, it would not be the existing world, right? It would not be eating meat from slaughterhouses and having plastic put into the ocean every time they open up the package for something, or actively contribute to the destruction of the global south and mining mineral resource extraction every time they pick up their phone. Like, that's not the world we would want to create. It also reminds me of, in Tantra, the idea of like mantra and mudra. When you look at like the ancient text, like mantra is not just a saying. It's not just like soham or something like that, or ya Allah. Mantra is more akin to enteleki. What is the world you want to see through the interaction of you with the world? And mudra is not just like putting your hands in prayer or symbols, but mudra is the physical embodiment of your mantra. It's like your entire body is your mudra, right? Your entire sort of energetic field is your mudra, because it's expressing your prayer. I don't think the role of post-capitalism is to replace socialism or communism or capitalism. It's more of like a container for ideas that transcend traditional structures of ownership, growth, accumulation, destruction. And it's based on shared values. And I think the more the spiritual community or political communities and others start to say, here's the values in which I stand, and here are examples of how generosity, altruism, interdependence, nonviolence, empathy, compassion, solidarity with all life, here's how they play out in concepts such as universal basic income or co-op ownership models or commons-based governance, or even self-selecting to be sort of taxed in a certain way, right? Or building communities and experiments outside that existing system. And so we can create contexts in which we are food sovereign, which we're not dependent on this existing system. That does require practice, and it requires sacrifice to a certain extent. And this is how we come back full circle to the idea of entitlement, right? Because our entitlement and the belief that we should have food whenever we want from the local grocery store without doing any work for that, or any sort of energetic exchange or request for permission from the land, this is how it's playing out. Being explicit to the living animate planet on what your values are then creates the potentiality and the multiple streams of possibility that will allow you to enact that mantra and that mudra. And how do we, with the deepest humility, ask the living animate planet through our prayer and through our daily practice and through our embodiment and through mantra and mudra, how we could be in deepest service to that unfolding. The old Sufi proverb is that humility is the aphrodisiac of the gods. One of the means by which the dominant system controls us is through this idea of consistency. better to be a Goldman Sachs banker who's sort of knows their values and is just a pure, extraction, destruction machine than to be somebody who's trying to be in service and has to deal with the messiness and the contradiction of living in a, totalitarian globalized market economy. And, there's that old Ralph Waldo Emerson line where he says, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, right? And it's like consistency is not the goal, it's practice. And part of our practice is how do we be more and more aware of the entanglements so we can be in deeper and deeper service to post-capitalist futures, and we can remove the aspects of our lives that aren't consistent with our values. This is also related to both the ideas of like self-responsibility and deciding like what is enough and what are we willing to give up? What is abundance, right? And especially in spiritual communities, this idea of abundance, I find it can often be this very sort of dangerous double-edged sword. And there's a line that's come to me a few times, which is abundance is not the manifestation of physical wealth. It is the absence of scarcity from the heart. So abundance is not the manifestation of physical wealth. It's the absence of scarcity from the heart. So the aim of even the idea of abundance and manifestation that have been sort of co-opted by the New Age is not to have more within the capitalist system, right? It's to remove the scarcity that we have inherited as people born into this dying culture of globalized Western capitalism. And the more we remove the scarcity from our heart, the more in trust we will be of the universe and the planet, and the less we will need, and the more in touch we will be with our context and those around us. And that relational web of beingness, not just with human beings, but with all beings seen and unseen, deepens. That's abundance.
Thank you for listening. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and it has sparked some inspiration and creativity in you. This is one of our timeless editions, a short and powerful piece of wisdom for you to contemplate, integrate, and embody. We have an archive of over 200 epics, long, deep conversations for you to explore, share, and enjoy. We keep this podcast advertising free as we don't want to sell you things that you don't need. This is made possible by you supporting our work as a member of Presence Collective, a patron, or through joining our offerings. You can also support us by sharing this with those that you love. Can you send it to 10 people who you know will find it powerful? This podcast is made by an all-female global team. You can explore our world at allthatweare.org and find your ways to take part. All That We Are celebrates all that we are already and the untapped potential that lives inside us. We exist to offer a space of sanctuary in the ever-increasing chaos, a place where you can come and be in good company, a place where you can learn, unlearn, and connect to your own wisdom. And know that in each and every moment, all that we are is here.